I also want to reiterate how deeply sorry Canada is for the situation this put President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation in.
It took several days, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did eventually apologize on behalf of Parliament for honoring a veteran during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Canada last week, who, it turns out, was a Nazi. The apology came after intense political pressure and countless international headlines. Now, the feds may be facing scrutiny from allies once again, with the news they're planning to cut nearly $1 billion from the defense budget. Just about 2 months after they signed on to a pledge with NATO to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Our Sunday strategy session is here to unpack all of that. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Corey Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody.
Hey there.
Good to see you. Corey, I'll start with you. There was obviously a lot of international reaction to what unfolded in the House of Commons during or right after President Zelensky's remarks, but there was some domestic back and forth as well. Do you think the Prime Minister's apology in the middle of the week kind of blunted that?
I think it largely did. It's still a very embarrassing thing to have occurred, and I think it's going to echo on long into the future in terms of one more thing on the list of faux pas by this government, where it'll be added to the list of passports and other missteps. But I think the applause line or laugh line at the end is going to be, and even had everyone stand and applaud for a Nazi in the House of Commons. So I think it's going to leave a scar. But I'm not sure really where the story goes from here. It's happened. Apology has been made. The speaker has resigned. I think all of those things are appropriate. But it's going to leave a scar. But I'm not sure it really is going to be dominating question period in the weeks to come. That's for sure.
Well, in fact, Corey's right, Scott. Next day it stopped, basically. On Thursday, I noticed the Conservatives move on to focus back on economic issues, primarily the price on carbon or the carbon tax. Does that signal to you that largely the domestic political back and forth is kind of over?
It does, and it should. I mean, what place would you go to next? I mean, the Speaker clearly made the mistake. The Speaker accounted for that by resigning. The Prime Minister, I think correctly, apologized for the spectacle of it as head of government on behalf of the entire House. I frankly thought that the Conservatives were a bit unhinged. I just thought that the tone and the tenor from the Conservatives is the grandest diplomatic embarrassment of all time. It's really? Okay, first of all, it's not a competition. Okay, this was an awful thing that occurred. It was an embarrassment. You don't need to just crank it constantly through the partisan wood splitter. So yeah, I think the week is behind us, and I don't think it's going to come up a lot again.
Kathleen, the opposition, and it was primarily the Conservatives, but the NDP were critical of the feds too, had a little bit of space to do so, or a vacuum was created to do so, because it's not like the Speaker resigned right away, nor did the Prime Minister step out right away, to be fair, right? It took a few days. At this, I totally understand the critique of how far they took it, but there was that window that they were able to provide them with almost.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm most interested in unpacking or understanding why the Prime Minister made and the Prime Minister's office made the decisions they did. They could have gotten out ahead of this. In some ways, the Prime Minister was waiting for kind of a fictitious sequencing to happen. They wanted the Speaker to resign first. They were worried about stepping into the Conservatives' over-exaggerated rhetoric and the trap that they were setting them, like what Scott was just saying. But they didn't need to wait. They could have gotten out ahead of it. They could have just done the right thing and apologized right away. And that, to me, I wonder, is a bit of a tell. Last week with the India allegations, they were on offensive footing. They were out there. They were, on their front foot, and they were leaning in hard. And maybe it was because the Prime Minister was out there on that ledge for so long by himself and kind of getting a lot of international kind of pushback towards the beginning of last week that maybe they were a bit more timid with this.
The other story that's starting to generate international reaction, Corey, is the fact that now, according to General Wayne Eyre, the Chief of Defense Staff, they're going to cut $1 billion annually from the national defense budget just a few months after they agreed to another NATO pledge to say that they'd try and meet at least 2% of GDP as qualified as defense spending. Do you think there are domestic ramifications for something like that?
Well, I know Scott and David and others will disagree with me strongly on this, that they think there's no consequence, but I think there can be. I think there can be. And this cut of $1 billion is also has to be framed in the context of them sending $9.5 billion in military aid to the Ukraine, and including weapon systems that the Canadian military has been asking for a generation, like surface-to-air missiles. And basically they're saying no to very primary equipment and capacity within our own military, while exporting to another country those things, while simultaneously moving in the exact opposite direction that the United States and other NATO allies are looking to Canada to move in. So, we're going to be even further away from those targets in terms of military spending that we should be at, based on our others in that alliance. I think it speaks to a declining influence of Canada in the world abroad. It may not be something that the election swings on, but it's certainly something that adds to a narrative that I think is overall very negative for this government.
Scott, Corey kind of telegraphed what you might say, but I'm thinking, I guess my question is more, is there anything different about it this time? Because previous governments of all different persuasions, political persuasions, have also made cuts to defense, and largely there have not been tangible consequences for them domestically. Does the different kind of environment that we're in right now with this war in Ukraine change that at all, do you think, or no?
Honestly, I don't think so. Like, if I want to be really honest, to be fair, just because something isn't important in terms of whether or not it will swing votes in the next election doesn't mean it isn't necessarily important. So I don't want to be glib about an issue as important as this.
I'm asking the crass strategic question here, don't worry.
But also, I think, we do get a bit breathless about this. We don't really know where this story is at. We've got, the Chief of Defense Staff testifying before Parliament raising this. This is, you get this internal Ottawa politics. Okay, I'm going to float the fact that there's going to be a big cut coming. That then gives me leverage with politicians. We move it around. We'll see. The thing I would say that's a bit different for the Trudeau government is suddenly on defense, it's part of a broader storyline. Suddenly throughout this fall, we're going to hear the Trudeau government insisting that it wishes to cut back, that it wants to pare back spending, that it's going to trim budgets, that it wants to reallocate and reduce spending. And I think that's going to have some political consequences. And I think it's going to mean, like, if it's real, then it's going to limit the choices they can make in terms of responding to things that they care about. And when you go to the voters and you think about the fact that they fish in the pond of the NDP Liberal switchers in order to win the next election, do people listen to the Beatles for country music? Do people turn into the Trudeau Liberals to talk about spending cuts? So I'm curious to see how they manage that going forward.
Well, I think Scott brings up a great point. Like, it's a whole new world. I personally can't even envision that kind of rhetoric sort of defining their brand in any way going forward, but that's the signal they're sending.
Yeah, and we've been hearing that from the ministers in this cabinet since the summer. It started with Chrystia Freeland with her kind of tersely worded letter to new Mayor Olivia Chow in Toronto, and then we've heard more recently just the new defense minister, Minister Blair, saying, yeah, we got to tighten our belts. But I do think it will have an impact on our international relations, whether it has an impact on the domestic voting and the political outcomes. I do think that Canada for too long has relied on a reputation that was like burnished 30, 40 years ago. And they're trying to still dine out on that. And you can't do that for that much longer. Not only is defense cuts, it's also cuts to our foreign aid budget, right? Which was took a massive slaughter just this past budget in the spring. And so I do think that at some point this government is internationally paying that price, and our allies are starting to see us, especially when we just committed in Europe, this past summer to the 2% once again, even though we all know that's never going to happen.
We do. Okay. Well, I got to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Kathleen Monk, Scott Reed, and Corey tonight.